Thank you, Puck. Hi, everyone. So great to meet you. I'm a former founder myself and then a longtime startup operator. So I love being in this environment with this community. And this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I'm going to let our incredible panelists introduce themselves in just a moment, but want to set the stage for a second. So I'm sure that all of you have a finger on the pulse of the fundraising data right now. Like, it is tough. It is not 2020. But what we are seeing at Fidelity, working with startups through our new Fidelity for Startups program, is that the smartest founders are using this time to take stock of where they are and get prepared. And they are doing this in a variety of ways. Smart founders are preparing themselves operationally speaking. They're getting really tight on their expenses and cutting cash burn to extend their cash runway. Smart founders are also working hard to make sure that they're ready to raise. They're getting their cap table in order. They're getting their documentation in order. And this is something that we love to see, because both of those strategies of getting really tight on your operations and getting really tight on your data room, those are the kinds of strategies that will make a startup's life and a founder's life far easier in the future as they continue to grow and as they are seeking fundraising. So I couldn't be more excited about this topic right now, because I think there are a few things that a founder can focus on at the moment, aside from, of course, generating revenue, which is always important at this moment in time. So sort of, as I mentioned, I'm a founder myself and then longtime startup operator. I'm now at Fidelity, building Fidelity for Startups, which is a new part of the business, but super exciting to think about what is possible with a Boston headquartered company like Fidelity working to support founders. And our flagship product is a cap table management solution. So we're working really closely with founders to help them think about how to manage their shareholders, how to make equity grants to employees, how to get prepared to raise money. So that's a little bit of the context on why this topic matters so much to all of us. And we're going to get into the nitty gritty of how you all can think about making sure your cap table, your data room is squeaky clean so that you are ready to raise. But let me allow our incredible panelists to introduce themselves and their areas of focus. Laura, do you want to start?
Sure. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see you guys today. My name is Laura Stoffel. I am a partner at a law firm by the name of Gunderson Detmer. Some of you may have heard of us before. We are the exclusive international firm focused in the innovation economy only. So other firms focus in many different areas, including the innovation economy. That's all that Gunderson does. We represent startups of all stages and in all verticals. So on any given day, I will be talking to a young student who wants to get something off the ground, who's interested in being venture backed, and I will be moving on to the next call to someone who might be like a CEO of a late stage startup that's about to go public. So there's no space of the startup cycle that we don't touch. We've had the distinct privilege and honor of being ranked the #1 VC law firm over the last decade, year after year. And our mission is to really support founders and startups in every aspect of their legal needs. You want to form a company, hire a co-founder, issue equity, let someone go, take out a line of credit, raise a venture round. You want to sell the company. You've gotten big enough that you want to buy a company. You want to license something. You need help with a commercial contract for a manufacturing facility. Whatever it is, we are a one-stop shop for founders.
Great. Hard to follow on that. But I'm Jenny Sia. I'm an investor at the Climate Innovation Fund at Wellington Management. We are a late venture, early growth venture investor, meaning from a letters perspective, we typically invest in companies Series B and C. And we invest exclusively in companies that help with climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. That being said, we are actually one of 4 venture funds at Wellington. So we actually have an earlier stage fund, a pre-IPO fund, as well as a biotech fund. In terms of this particular conversation, I probably looked at close to 100 data rooms by now as an investor. So I very much look forward to this conversation. It's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart.
Thanks, Jenny. Phil?
Hi, everyone. I'm Phil McManus. I am a serial entrepreneur and angel investor. Currently co-founder and CEO of a company called Wave Data. We are a blockchain-based consumer data sharing technology for businesses to share consumer data in a way that's rooted in consumer consent and fully encrypted end-to-end. Similar same way that we used to store credit cards on databases, and we learned that was a really bad idea. We need to learn that doing that with consumer data is sort of the next hurdle that we need to go beyond, where we can tokenize and reference our consumer data instead of letting it flow unencrypted and raw through multiple businesses. Prior to this, I sold my last company, Logo Mix, to a public company, so I can talk a little bit about some of what goes into that, having been through the cycle. And then also I'm an angel investor. I help run an angel group here that's now started in New England, but actually international at this point, called TBD Angels. We're a member of about a group of 300 angel investors, primarily who have founders who have had exits or large company executives. And then also on the blockchain side, co-founder of a angel group called the Investment DAO as well. So happy to talk, as well from both the founder side of managing and dealing with this stuff, but also can speak a little bit to the very earlier stages with an angel investor hat on as well.
Awesome. So I want to make sure that we start with a little bit of context about, we'll get into the nitty gritty on cap table best practices in management, but just to set the stage a little bit more for those who have not raised, actually, let's do a quick show of hands. Of the folks in the room, can you raise your hand if you have experience raising capital before? Okay, that is awesome. And then of the folks in the room, by show of hands, who is either currently raising or preparing to raise within the next 3 months, let's say? Ooh, love to see that. That is awesome. Okay, so this is great. I know we have a number of folks who have raised before. That is excellent. For those who have not, I want to make sure that we set the stage with a bit of context about sort of what is the general process? What does it feel like as a founder? What are some of the things that make that process a little bit easier or harder? So I guess, Phil, would you mind giving a little bit of context about what a first-time founder especially might want to expect from that process?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because ultimately, your goal is to raise capital to grow your business, right? And as a first-time founder, you're an unknown quantity, right? So I think that's one of the biggest things to try and overcome with investors is you need to not only be able to show why your background and experience is relevant to what you're trying to build, but also that separate from investing in the idea, you as a founder, the team in particular is very big as well, right? That's only part of it. Part of it is this business going to succeed? Is it going to be run well? And I think that's where there's this balance of, especially think towards earlier stages, right? You just don't have a lot of things figured out yet. And if you think you have everything figured out, I guarantee you don't. There's going to be something you're going to find that you're like, whoa, I didn't even realize this along the way. And that's why I think it's so important to show that you're going to be able to be versatile with what's going to happen with the business going forward, that you're going to be able to roll with the punches because things will come up that you don't expect. And I think that's really one of the most important things to be able to try and communicate to investor, right? It's not just, in earlier stages in particular, not as many things are figured out. So they're investing just as much in the team, you as a founder, your ability to execute and grow going forward.
Thank you. And then getting a little bit more specific around documentation. Laura, would you fill everybody in a little bit on like what documentation do founders tend to gather? And Jenny, I'll be curious about your perspective as well as like what are some of the other things that like investors particularly love to see? But will you kick us off, Laura?
Sure. So as soon as you signed your term sheet, you are going to get from the investors something called a due diligence request letter. And that will be, a 4 to 6 page document asking you to upload to a data room a string of different items: board approvals, stockholder consents, material agreements, decks. And one of those things will be your current cap table. Your existing cap table is incredibly important to the investor because they want to make sure that they are getting the percentage of the company that they've negotiated for. So if everyone is working off of a cap table that isn't quite right, it can have significant implications for the deal. Now, the key is that the cap table is not the evidence of your cap table. The documents that you enter into along the way are the evidence for your cap table. So some founders may just think, let me upload the cap table, I'm all set there, but actually it's a much more involved process, and one that unfortunately can't always be retroactively corrected. In order to substantiate the cap table, your investor or your investor's counsel will be looking for very specific things in your data room. Your board of directors, whether that's 1 co-founder, 2 co-founders, 3 co-founders, will have to have documented every equity issuance that is reflected on the cap table. So founder stock, initial options, you did a safe round. If there isn't a contemporaneously signed board approval for those items, it's going to throw into question whether those things were duly authorized and whether they in fact actually exist. So doing the process correctly is actually quite important to substantiate the cap table.
Thank you so
If
much.
I could real quick, there's something you said that I wanted to make sure got brought up somewhere along the way. It is one of the only things in a business you cannot retroactively correct. If you take nothing away from this session, that would be the one thing I would encourage you to take. If you got something wrong in your deck, if you didn't communicate your go-to-market plan, those can all be adjusted, right? But when you look at cap table and equity, especially as sort of look, a lot of people are doing things like, stacking safes, right? If you don't, and I don't want to get that technical on this, right? But there's a lot of things that if you haven't been thinking about your fundraising and what your cap table looks like, when you sort of include everything that you've done, you can't just say, oh, sorry, let me go grab an eraser and change this number, right? Because there's activities that you've taken, and it's really important to be thoughtful about those.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, Phil is a Fidelity cap table shoebox client. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say, like, one of the things that we care deeply about when building our cap table management product, which PS is not the case with other cap tables, is like, it is foolproof. You cannot enter something into that without having the documentation associated with it. It was built intentionally to be foolproof because it is so disastrous if it is not correct during that due diligence process. So it's the kind of thing that like it kind of feels like it doesn't matter until it matters deeply. And so having that sort of foolproof nature there is so critically important. And it's actually been a huge reason why many of the folks who use Fidelity's shoebox cap table, we have a client who's able to close in 12 days. I'm sure Laura can attest to the fact that is very unusual. Usually the due diligence process takes a lot longer. And that speed matters. Like if you're trying to make payroll, if you're trying to make some key hires, if you're trying to build on like bring on a head of engineering, like that speed matters a lot at that moment in time. But yes, I would love to also hear your perspective, Jenny, on what are some of the other kinds of things that you like to see, or almost like the how or the organization that you tend to like to see when you are preparing to invest in a company.
Yeah, sure. So I guess thus far we've talked a lot. Laura mentioned a lot about the kind of the post-term sheet materials, but maybe I could touch a little bit on pre-term sheet. What are the materials that your investor probably will expect you to have? So I guess first and foremost, definitely is a company deck, which illustrates why we should be excited about your deal and what vision for your company you have for the future. Secondly, it would be great to have some financial model, just because it kind of illustrates to us like how you envision your company to work and scale financially in the future, and that you actually do have a vision for that. And it's not necessarily at an early stage about accuracy, like whether or not you're actually going to hit your financial model, but more to show us how you're thinking about your business plan and how you're thinking about it as it scales. And then beyond that, it's always helpful to have like a sales pipeline as well, so we can kind of assess early commercial traction. And I'd say even pre-term sheet, we also do like to see the cap table, just so we understand as we go post-term sheet where our investment will ultimately land.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So thinking about where things can go wrong, what to avoid, I would love to hear both of your perspectives on what are some of the elements that first-time founders tend to overlook, or pieces that aren't quite as tight or clean as they need to be. Like, where have you seen things go off the rails? Laura, maybe you could start.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, what we touched on, founders may think this is my cap table, Laura, and then I have to let them know that that's not actually the case. But taking a little bit of a deeper dive, option grants. The general guidance and what I strongly recommend is that before you grant an option, you get a 409A valuation. And the reason why that's so critical is because it shifts the burden away from you as a founder and you as a board member in terms of how did you get to that strike price for that option. When Jenny does her due diligence and she doesn't see a 409A for your option grants, she's going to scratch her head and be like, how did Susan come up with 5 cents for this option? If you misprice options, if you grant them below the fair market value of your stock, there can be penalties for the company and the person who received the option. So it is in everyone's best interest that you get a 409A before you issue options. The second reason is if you give an option at a discounted price, the difference in that price between what your option is actually worth and what you issued it as is taxable, as compensation, and you wouldn't have been properly withholding on that spread. So it pains me to say this a little bit because I know that conserving cash is so important early on, but you would be very prudent to go out and get a 409A valuation. And I don't provide 409A valuations. Those are third-party valuation providers before you start issuing options.
Great point. And I will say there are many ways that founders cut corners on that. You can get an automated 409 valuation. Probably not the best idea for something that matters so deeply, where the penalties are so high, where really the sort of future of your company and your own compensation and that of your team is tied up in the accuracy of that number. So I'd say, like, be choosy about where you choose to shave costs. Like, always a good strategy, but like, be choosy there. What about you, Jenny? Any perspective on what founders sometimes tend to overlook or get wrong?
Yeah, I guess just to augment Laura's point, I think generally speaking, I would just always err on the side of being more clear and transparent as you can, because if your investor is doing their job, they will ask the hard questions, and it's always better if you're forthcoming about it versus not. And I actually had a very recent example of something of this nature happening to me. And no, I invest in companies that typically have operated for 3 to 5 years. So these are somewhat experienced, quite experienced operators. But there was an example where we were investing in a company, and this particular company, their revenue growth was not quite as desired. It was a little bit flat, which is a bit of a concern for an investor at my stage. And so we ultimately decided to pass on the company without digging deeper, because revenue growth is just very essential for a growth investor like myself. And once we actually spoke with the founder, in conversation, we actually realized that there was a very concrete reason of why there was a slump in the revenue growth, but the founder had not provided that clarity in the data room at that first stage. And so even though I think that for that particular case, I don't know if that would have changed our opinion about the deal, I think for a lot of other investors, that could have made the difference between passing on the deal outright and taking another look. So I would always err on the side of more clarity and more transparency than not.
Super interesting. And I would actually love to know a little bit more, like, are there other, not red flags, but let's say sort of like orange flag items that you've seen founders fail to include because maybe they're nervous that might dissuade an investor from coming in? Like, are there other elements like that that you've seen founders not include?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, like, just speaking specifically on the cap table, sometimes founders and companies omit some complexities like convertible notes or warrants. And the reality is, we, as an investor, we have to understand all those things. So it's really best to include those to start. Versus like having us have to dig deeper, because it's not really good use of anyone's time. And also it gives a little bit of a negative impression for the investor doing due diligence if they have to dig in for that kind of information.
Great, thank you. And I think that the revenue, not slump, but flatlining, let's say, is a really important part that's a piece that's so relevant right now. Investors know that the climate is a little funky right now, especially if you're in the B2B space. Like, you might have early customers who are trying to trim costs themselves. And so, savvy investors know that. But I think it's a really interesting point around not trying to hide that, but being really upfront about that. Because remember, the people that you are inviting onto your cap table, because remember, that is a privilege to let somebody have a piece of ownership in your baby and this thing that you are working so hard to build. That is a long-term relationship that you are building. And so trust is paramount. Staying with that theme of trust, I'm curious about the, sort of what happens if somebody does get this wrong. I was chatting with a woman who used to run a Techstars cohort, and she was sharing with me that one of her Techstars founders was preparing to close on their A round, and an error was found. Not just an error. Issues were found, pretty sizable issues. And actually the lead investor pulled out of the process because it was so alarming to them that they didn't feel great about going in on that. So I'm curious about this, from the legal ramifications, like what are the costs of fixing issues that come up during due diligence, and then also what are the relationship issues or the relationship costs in terms of erosion of trust. Laura, may we start with you?
So I'll start with what happens if the issue is identified before the wire hits versus after the wire hits. If the issue is identified after the wire hits, you will have been in breach of reps that you made to the investor. Now, investors are not going to go around and sue their portfolio companies. That's very unlikely, and we see that in hardly any instances. That doesn't make good business sense, and reputationally it would harm you. But what they may do is partially unwind the deal to reflect a price adjustment because they may not own what they expected to own because of an omission that was made. If the issue can be identified before, ideally, this is the issue. As soon as you sign a term sheet, you can no longer grant equity or fix equity, because now that you have a term sheet that pegs your company's valuation, we can no longer take the position that your stock and your options are cheap. So what I would highly recommend is that founders work with their counsel to make sure things are in place before you sign anything, because it will be much easier to fix things before you've crossed that threshold. And that can be painful advice to hear, because what founder in their right mind would delay signing a term sheet? It would be worthwhile in this instance, because there's only so much we can do based on the parameters that we're working in. Mostly we can clean it up. Lawyers can get very creative before you signed it to make sure that we get to the place that we need to be. But after you sign the term sheet, it can be much more difficult. But I think, as Jenny's pointed out, certainly don't try to hide the ball from your legal counsel. They are there to help you. And from a relationship standpoint, try not to be shady with your investors, because they will be part of your team as soon as the investment is made, and you want to be forthcoming. Mistakes happen. Investors see mistakes all the time. How you handle that mistake and present it to the investor will very much matter in terms of how your relationship proceeds from there.
So continuing to look at this through the lens of relationship building, Jenny, from your perspective, what are the types of strategies or approaches that can help foster a strong, trusting relationship, and what are the factors that might erode that?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the adjective I used earlier, which is like being more transparent and clear. And I think this also goes for data room organization. Just in general, if I go into a data room and I can't navigate it, or there's just so many documents that I don't know what I should look at, and it's not very clear to me how I should understand this business, it's just before we even go to term sheet, it's just a little bit off-putting, and you should really try to make your company as clear as possible for an investor to assess. And I can say, as a later stage investor, we've never pulled out of a deal post-term sheet, but definitely pre-term sheet, there have been a couple of deals where we've seen issues with the balance sheet, and it looks funky, where they've made these mistakes on the financial model that grossly change the ultimate outcomes of the business if you look at it in the future. And that just makes us wonder, like, operationally, like, what is this company like? It almost is a proof point in terms of management competence, in terms of how they're organizing their materials. So I think that is one aspect to consider as well.
Thank you. So I want to hand things over to Phil in a moment, but just to sing his praises for a second. I think it's really cool, the perspective that Phil brings, because he is, as you heard, a serial entrepreneur. He's also a very active angel investor. And he's a very generous person with his time and his advice to founders within this Boston community. And as you and I were talking in preparation for this, you reminded me that you also have experience in M&A, which, from my perspective, working with the founder community here in New England and beyond, this is the topic where I've seen the largest and fastest uptick in questions. I think that founders are realizing, ooh, my cash runway is shrinking, and I don't know that I'm ready to raise, or I'm not getting the feedback that I'm wanting. Should I be considering an M&A path? And it's so great that we have Phil, who can share perspective on fundraising as well as M&A. So will you tell us a little bit from the founder perspective about how you approach running a tight process and fostering great documentation when you are raising money, as well as considering M&A?
Yeah. So I think to start off, I'll touch, I guess, first on raising, right? I think all of the advice that's been given by the other panelists is fantastic. They're spot on with what they've said. So I think if you're thinking about raising, I would encourage everyone to just take a little time to spend a little time on sort of the admin work, right? It's the least fun process for most people, especially startup founders. Startup founders generally don't like paperwork. They don't like having to follow the rules. Most people are doing a startup because they want to do something outside of the system. This is unfortunately one of the few moments in your business where you really need to work inside of a system, right? You can't just say, no, right? Because the people that are going to give you money are going to require that information. So, I think that's sort of one of the big things I would think about is to just make sure that if you're getting ready for this, you're thinking that through. I think another thing from the fundraising standpoint is, being able to have open and transparent dialogue with investors, right? I think is really important, as they both mentioned. Switching over to thinking about, exits, right? And sort of long-term, what you're doing with your business. I think there's a couple things that I'd encourage everyone to think about. The first thing is that you will likely, if you're running a business that's growing, right, you will likely come across opportunities along the way where people will say, I'm interested in acquiring your business. Those moments are really exciting because someone's validating, right, what you've worked so hard on. But I've talked to founders, and we had some things along the way in my last business where you had to sort of stop and say, is now the right time, right? So, and I think that when you hit those moments, that's sort of a time to do a little bit of a gut check on where do you think you're going with the business? How much further do you think it's going to go? Because I've also talked to a lot of founders who've been in a situation where they had that opportunity, an offer on the table, and they said no. They didn't take it, and then later things just never worked out, right? So always important not to sort of take a bleak view there, right? But very important to think about that. Is you start to, if you're at that point where you're like, okay, I think now is the moment. I think a couple things I encourage everyone to do is, first off, don't take the first offer you see. I think one of the things that we did that was very successful at Logo Mix is we hired an investment banker to work with, and they helped us run a process. So just because someone says, I'm willing to buy your business, there's probably other people that are interested in that. So that's something I'd encourage everyone to think about. It's another tough, it's a tough pill to swallow because there's cost associated with that. There's time associated with that. You also risk, in the same way that fundraising, right? You may have an offer on the table and that could go away. So again, something to be very thoughtful about, but that's one of the things I'd encourage everyone to do is to get professional help from someone who really knows things in that space. And then, going through as sort of you get into diligence, I would, suggest people talk to your lawyer, talk to other founders, find out what things you need to get together. There's been a number of things already sort of talked about on the panel, today, but the more you can get those things together in advance, the better you look, the faster it's going to get done. And even as you're looking at M&A, right, there's still possibilities where deals can get blown up at the last minute, right? Just because someone signs an LOI, acquire your business, does not mean it's done. You are under scrutiny from that acquirer the whole time you're going through that process. So that's, one of the things that we really did a great job of was we got that diligence list, right, that was mentioned, and we said, all right, let's just get all of this stuff together right now. And I'll tell you something, there's going to be things that you don't have. So find out what those are and put them in place, right? A lot of times it may be administrative things like policies they'd like to see. Great, go adopt that policy. And you want to make sure that you're checking all of those boxes, right? So I think that's, one of the things to keep in mind as you start going down that path is that you really have to think about it's not done until it's done. And there's a lot of time and effort that you need to go through. And that also from a relationship standpoint, right? You're about to get acquired by someone. You're also showing them how you're going to work and what they're getting into long-term with you in your business, right? So you're also putting your reputation on the line as well in that process.
Great points, Phil. Thank you. So I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions from everyone here. I know we also have a question or two that's come in from the folks who are joining virtually. But one last question I'd love to pose to all three of you. So some words of wisdom about maintaining equilibrium. Fundraising is tricky. Preparing to fundraise is tricky. There are a lot of, tasks to be done, a lot of emotional ups and downs. What have you seen the most successful and the most resilient founders keep an eye on or focus on in order to help them not only have, a successful outcome, but also, I think most importantly, make sure that they're still doing a great job building the business that was so inspiring to them to build in the first place? And why don't we start with you, Phil?
Yeah, I'd say, equilibrium, that is such a challenge in these scenarios, right? From a fundraising standpoint, we all know there's only so many hours in a day, right? And you're working on building and scaling a business. I think one of the things I'd encourage you to think about is how are you going to allocate your time on fundraising? Because time you are spending on fundraising is keeping you away from building a product, building the team, serving clients, acquiring more clients. So it really is a balance. I'd say there is no golden rule. Every situation is sort of based on what you're working with and your situation. So I think you need to be really thoughtful about that. And that's one of the things I'd really encourage people to think through. Sort of flipping over, I'll just touch on the M&A thing for a minute. Wow, going through selling a business is intense. You need to be, I think one of the things that I would sort of tell someone now that I didn't realize at that point is that you need to be mentally prepared to work a whole secret job that no one knows about while making zero indications that there are any disruptions in the current ongoing operations of the business. So you really need to be thoughtful about how you do that, right? Because it can be very demoralizing to the team if you start saying, oh, hey, we're trying to do this and something changes or shifts along the way, right? So I think that's another thing, you really need to make sure that you're ready for and you're mentally preparing for, is that it is a large undertaking and you are taking on a full second secret job, is sort of how I sort of thought about it as we went through it.
Jenny, how about you? What have you seen founders do well?
Yeah, I guess first of all, as we all know, fundraising is very hard and investors know this deeply as well. And so I would definitely say if you are fundraising, definitely first and foremost, give yourself grace. One thing that I've seen founders do well is that some founders I know, they start developing relationships with investors early. So fundraising isn't for them a kind of a continuous process. So when they actually need capital, they already know that they have many options available. And so they're not overly hung up with when a few investors don't work out. They know there's a long game here to play, and investor relationships can bring you value not only by helping you fundraise, but also by introducing you to customers, by introducing you to other investors. So there's a lot of benefits to developing relationships with investors outside of just your fundraising process. And I think it will also help to make your fundraising slightly less stressful.
Do we have students in the room? We have current students and we have former students in the room. If you procrastinate, it will be more painful. And that is true of raising a round as well. So it does not need to be stressful at all. If you can get organized in advance, make sure your documents are dated and signed and lined up in a Google Drive, that's fine, or a folder on your desktop. If it's backed up, that's fine as well. It doesn't have to be bad at all. It can look like a 30-minute kickoff call and then people leaving you alone on the diligence front because you've uploaded everything that you need to. So I think it's important to note it doesn't have to be a scary or unfortunate situation. It can be quite easy. And for many people in this room, you may not have all that many documents, but enough in terms of what you should have. It may end up maybe a zip file that you send to the investor that just has your formation docs. Be like, here's what I have on the legal side, and here are the 3 commercial contracts I've signed. And that could be the entire extent of your diligence process. But the more data you have, the longer you've been around, the more organized you'll need to be in advance in order for it not to be painful. Because as you know, Kristen and the other panelists have said, you need to be focused on the business. I mean, oftentimes, especially early stage, you're the one running the show. You can't be, disappearing on diligence calls for like 3 hours a day. So it would behoove you to get organized early, and then the process can actually be quite smooth.
Thank you. And then I can't resist from throwing in my 2 cents about this. Anybody who knows me has heard me say this before, so I apologize if you've heard this. But I'm a huge believer in the power of community. And specifically, I'm a huge believer in the power of this community in Boston and New England. I deeply believe that this is the best place to start a company. It is the best place to grow a company because, of course, not only do we have incredible intellectual horsepower here coming from so many different domains, but I also happen to believe that this is the most generous ecosystem in which to build. I think that people here are so forthcoming with their advice, with their own lessons learned, sometimes the hard way, so that you hopefully don't have to learn it the hard way, with their time, with their introductions. And so my 2 cents on what can help founders get through this process, because it is hard sometimes, is leaning on your community. Seek out the people who can help you and make those asks even when that feels scary. For me personally, I volunteer myself. Please reach out to me. I love doing this with founders. I spend a ton of time working with the founders who keep their cap table with us, brainstorming investors that they might want to talk to, and then thinking about how I might be able to facilitate a warm introduction, or even better, how I might be able to get them into the same room as that investor at an event that we're hosting at the Fidelity office, for example. And I am one of so many people who are really active in this ecosystem and who really want to be hubs of connectivity for all of you who are working so hard. So please tap into the brains, the networks, the lessons learned of this community, because truly it is the most generous startup community that I have seen. And I've been around tech for a long time. So tap into this incredible community. So I want to leave some time for questions. Really quickly, I'm just going to scan this. A few quick questions people asked about: what's the best data room to use? What documents should you place in your data room? I might save that for you if we have time. And then, do most founders create their own cap tables in Excel or use a different software to track? I am obviously biased, but Fidelity has a great...
Real quick, don't try and do your own cap table in Excel, especially if you have given more than your founder's stock. It is so complex and complicated. Do not do that. Find a tool that's out there. Shoebox is great. There are others, but do not try and do it yourself.
Yes, I cannot underscore that enough. Move over earlier, you will not regret it. Fidelity's Shoebox product does have a free plan for founders, so check that out. It's super easy, and it has a connected data room that is pretty unique. So would love to chat with anybody, or Phil can tell you about that. But let's see, does anybody here in the room have a question?
And we've got about 1 minute, so if we can do a quick question, and then will you all be hanging around for a couple of minutes?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Super insightful panel. Thank you so much. Shazab Lada, question around intentionality of organic growth of your startup and where you want to end up, M&A, et cetera, right? How clear should you be at the beginning of the journey?
It's a great question. I think that you certainly need to have an idea, right, of where you're going in the long run, right? There should be a goal. I think it really depends on I think one of the things I encourage people to remember is that not every business is designed to go public. Not every business is designed to be a massive strategic opposition by, a public company, a private company. There's a lot of opportunities out there. So I think you really need to think about, I'd keep your sort of end game in mind, but I'd keep your options open, because it may pan out totally different than you think. When I look at the company that acquired Logomix Deluxe Corporation, they early on, they were not anywhere on our radar, and the right opportunity just presented itself, and it was a great fit for both companies. So you need to keep your options open, but you do need to sort of have a direction you're thinking about in your head.
Awesome. So we will wrap up here, but we'll all stick around. Thank you so much for making this day so amazing, making this week so amazing, and making this community so powerful.